mademoiselle? It will only last a little longer.
Oh. Oh.
Good evening, guys and ghouls, and welcome back to Monster Craze Memoirs, a generational podcast about B-movies. I am your host, Ian Garcia, and joining me as always is my father, Rocco.
Welcome to all.
So, when we last left off, we had just finished discussing James Whale's Frankenstein, and as I alluded to in that episode, or as we had discussed, Frankenstein was not actually the first project that Universal and Carl Laemmle Jr. were considering as a follow-up to Dracula. And in fact, Frankenstein was one of two projects that were in development concurrently that originally were both being considered as star vehicles for, of course, Bela Lugosi. Inevitably, one of those films did end up starring Bela Lugosi, the one that ended up languishing in development as Frankenstein sort of kept building up steam, and more or less, and then of course James Whale took over and Boris Karloff was cast as the monster instead of Bela Lugosi. And Bela Lugosi was a huge part of what made Dracula so popular and successful. It's interesting in the respect that these two movies made back-to-back, Frankenstein and then this project that was being developed concurrently, Murders in the Rue Morgue. It's interesting because it sort of maps out, or sort of sets the stage for the careers of both actors, especially in these kinds of horror and dark mystery movies. You know, it seemed as soon as Dracula had wrapped and was out and was doing very well at the box office and up critically as well, it seemed that, of course, Bela Lugosi was going to be the big star, that Bela Lugosi was going to be the main man that you craft these star vehicles around. But those things quickly change when Frankenstein ends up doing very well, and Murders in the Rue Morgue, on the other hand, does relatively, it does okay, but overall it doesn't perform nearly as well as Frankenstein or Dracula. And so Boris Karloff kind of takes off as a star, whereas Bela Lugosi kind of gets, despite his talents, gets sidelined as an actor. He doesn't get to play the sort of diversity of roles that Boris Karloff ends up being offered. And, Boris Karloff, at least occasionally, even if he plays villains, he seems to sometimes be able to break out of his horror film mold. And it's kind of a sad turn of events. And I guess, just to begin, because, you do have these two very iconic actors in the history of horror. For you, like, if it had to come down to the two of them, leave the movies themselves aside. If there's an actor who you appreciate more on the level of their talents and what they can bring to a project, do you think that you appreciate Karloff more or Lugosi?
Well, I appreciate Karloff more, but not because necessarily that I think Karloff was a better actor. I think you're right. I think the opportunities that Lugosi had a very interesting ability to. He changes the pace of a movie as if there are two different worlds going on. So when you look at him and say, even in Murders in the Rue Morgue, everything moves at a certain pace when the regular people, but as soon as he comes on screen, everything seems to slow down.
You had mentioned this with Dracula, how he does seem to have a sort of hypnotic effect on the other actors, where he just enters the room and he just kind of overpowers them with his presence, that there's something even animalistic about him.
Well, nice, and not only that, but the whole conversation, like the pace of even the dialogue shifts, because he just sort of like commands the area. Now, I don't know if it's the director's intention for that, or whether it's actually the people responding to Lugosi playing that role. But in any case, that's what I find that's so fascinating about Lugosi, and Karloff has the same kind of ability, but not quite as good as Lugosi. Lugosi given the features that we've seen, he has a kind of a wide range of different acting talents that and he shifts back and forth. So I don't know. It's hard to tell which one is better. I think I appreciate Karloff better for exactly the reason that you say. He can play even a heinous sympathetic character. For example, in the Body Snatcher, where he plays Burke, where he's at one time sympathetic, and at the same time he could be, obviously he's a murderer also. So, but again, is that because he was provided that he was able to respond to those roles better than Lugosi, or was just the fact that opportunities? My impression is that he probably has a little better range than Lugosi does.
I think that's maybe true. And I think what it comes down to is that, like, I think if I had to say who was technically the better actor, I would have to admit it is Karloff. But at the end of the day, I think after seeing Dracula, I have to admit that, like, I think there's just something more about Lugosi as just kind of like, I think what Karloff is, I think what is so attractive about him as a performer, and you see it in both Frankenstein and The Mummy that we also saw this week and will cover in the next episode. Zita Jahan, who plays Helen in The Mummy. Zita Jahan has mentioned that in interviews where she mentioned that Karloff kind of has like a sadness about him that just is so penetrating, and that you can immediately see it, that like you can see that that there's something behind just his features, which are very distinctive, of course, and perhaps more distinctive than Lugosi's. He's a very unusual looking man with these deep set eyes and this large forehead and of course the thing that attracted James Whale to him, his almost like cadaverous body, but you strip it of the makeup or you just focus on the eyes, and what you see is very tragic and a kind of sad man behind it. And I'm glad I did a supplemental episode on a little bit of Boris Karloff's biography, because I think that gives a certain impression of that he did have a really, despite coming from relative privilege, he really did have a fairly lonely and disappointed life for much of his youth before he finally made it in the 30s. But I think what it is about Lugosi, on the other hand, is that you see it especially in Dracula. It is what you say about him being able to slow things down, to just command the room to his pace. And I guess they both have that to a certain extent. But I think what you see in Murders in the Rue Morgue is a director who uniquely understands Lugosi, like how you can build the entire pacing of your movie around Lugosi's just, again, it's all in the eyes, just his deeply penetrating gaze, and just the way he can do so much with just his eyes that so few performers can. And I think that's a great aspect of Murders in the Rue Morgue, and it kind of makes it sad in a way, because, we're covering the Murders in the Rue Morgue and The Mummy because they both came out in 1932. This is the year where Karloff kind of takes over and Bela Lugosi gets sidelined as a performer. And a lot of it, I think, is just, even his limited range, like a lot of it probably just has to do with that, Lugosi is so much more obviously foreign than Karloff is. He's inherently going to be limited in a very sort of formulaic and prejudicial Hollywood to playing heavy characters and the occasional comic relief. So you really don't very much get to appreciate him, especially later on, as he was more or less just working for the paycheck, just trying to make ends meet, like just the way he was really very much underutilized. So it's kind of sad, because Murders in the Rue Morgue, it does underperform, and so it does lead to him being underutilized as an actor and underappreciated as an actor. So it's
But it gave him the opportunity for the greatest range, don't you think? I
yeah.
mean, Murders in the Rue Morgue, I think he did really very, very good. I mean, what holds that picture together is him. Um, and I don't think it was that limited of a, I guess you're saying, in terms of success.
Well, I think I mean more in the sense that Murders in the Rue Morgue kind of establishes the template for the kinds of characters that Lugosi would be forced to play for the rest of his career because no one really wanted him for anything else.
Right.
Although I will have to say that I think Murders in the Rue Morgue is probably, besides Dracula, probably the best showcasing of his acting ability and just his and his complexity. So let's just sort of break down the plot of Murders in the Rue Morgue, because it really is, and we'll get into it before even getting into the story it's based on, because I think the plot of the movie is it's loosely inspired by its source material, so there's only like a little superficial things that tie them together. Let's just break down the story of Murders in the Rue Morgue. Where are we at the beginning of Murders in the Rue Morgue? How do we open this movie?
In a sideshow, right? In a carnival atmosphere where you have which felt very...
In France in 1845.
Right, in France, and it really well done. I think even the set pieces, again, are very theatrical in nature. They're very, they're that you see the painted backgrounds, right? But in the foregrounds you see smoke coming out of smokestacks. So I mean, it gives you enough.
Yeah, it's not even just theatrical. It's of all the movies that Universal made during this period, this is probably the most directly influenced by German expressionism.
Yeah.
And that was no accident. The film is directed by Robert Florey, who was a French expatriate who came to Hollywood in the 1920s. He had previously directed some other movies, like most notably he directed the first Marx Brothers movie. But he was very much influenced by German Expressionism. He made a series of self-financed short films where you see the influence of German Expressionism all over them, and you see the influence of that on the set design for the movie. And during the production, very much like a German Expressionist, a real German Expressionist movie. When they couldn't get the shadows that they wanted for a particular shot, Florey and the director of photography, Karl Freund, would just instruct the set designers to paint the shadows where they were supposed to be. So there's that similarity to the German Expressionism.
Yeah, it reminds me of, was it
the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, obviously.
The angulations and the distance.
Not even just the angulations. Like, just the opening of a movie in a carnival is obviously directly lifted from the Cabinet of Dr. Caligari, which opens at a carnival. You follow the characters as they... Well, actually, it opens in an insane asylum, but it transitions to the carnival. And, of course, you have the titular Dr. Caligari, who has a sideshow with this somnambulist who he uses as his sort of slave. In Murders in the Rue Morgue, so you see the direct lifting of that, and even the premise of the movie is somewhat similar. But even like the director of photography of the movie, Karl Freund, he himself was a German cinematographer who had, been a part of the German Expressionist movement. He had been a cinematographer on The Head of Janus, which is now a lost film. He is probably best well known for his cinematography on Fritz Lang's Metropolis. So I
didn't realize that.
Yeah, so
wow.
he was very much a pioneer. So the bona fides here are definitely there. And I guess the thing that's it's also definitely, and of course, Florey, we mentioned previously, he was originally going to be the director of Frankenstein before James Whale kind of stole the project out from under him. But you see, and with Frankenstein, his concept for the movie was much more audacious. And I think you see that, technically speaking, in Murders in the Rue Morgue. There's a very audacious aesthetic approach, not just to the set design, but to the camera work. And you see it even in the opening carnival scene where the characters say, well, let's go see the exhibits. And then you get this wonderful sort of very smooth floating, what seems to be a crane shot over and through the crowd. It's this technique that Freund had actually pioneered called the unchained camera, which gave him a much more fluid and, in this case, I guess, like a sort of dreamlike quality to camera movement that wasn't really previously available to a lot of directors before. But I guess, definitely the aesthetics are something. But anyway, so we have our characters, our main, our sort of our heroine and our hero, Sidney Fox as Camille and Leon Ames as Pierre Dupont. These conventional sort of French lovers. They sort of bohemian characters. They're not very well-to-do, but they're at the carnival. They're enjoying themselves. And then, before we get into some of the other... So let's just follow that. So where do they end up at this carnival? Where do they... what's the final exhibit that they end up going to see?
The Ape Man.
Yeah, the Ape Man. Would you like to just describe the circumstances of the scene?
You mean going in?
Yeah, to describe in detail this scene, like the setup and what...
Well, you have the barker outside.
Right.
Who's advertising, see so-and-so, the Ape Man, come on in and then you go into the scene and and instead of the more frivolous kinds of disarray in a car where you start shouting out things and things like that, Lugosi comes out and he says, silence.
Yeah, Lugosi is playing Dr. Miracle. How is Dr. Miracle different from the regular carnival attractions? What's his whole deal? Because he's not really... They're coming to see a freak show, and that's not really what his objective is it?
No, his objective is to teach them evolution.
Yes.
And the proof of evolution.
Here is the story of man in the slime of chaos. There was the seed which rose and grew into the tree of life. Life was motion. Fins changed into wings, wings into ears, and crawling reptiles grew legs. Aeons of ages passed. There came a time when a four-legged thing walked upright. Behold, first man.
You had noticed this, that even in the background he has painted on a tapestry in the background the process of evolution from single-celled organisms all the way to modern man.
Right, from the sea right to land, right. Mm-hmm.
So who is helping him in the illustration of evolution? Who is this ape man that he has presented for him?
He's just a gorilla.
Yeah.
Someone in costume, but they use a chimpanzee.
Do you remember the name of the ape?
No.
Eric.
Eric was the name of the ape?
Yeah.
Okay.
So Eric is the sideshow ape. And yeah, you mentioned this, he's supposed to be a gorilla, but every time, when it's not a man in a suit, which is for the full shots, when it's close-ups, it's obviously an older male chimpanzee, but... Obviously, many audiences in the 1930s would not be able to distinguish the difference, but...
Well, they would know you could tell it's a cut-in, or however you say it, an insert.
Yeah, he very much introduces Eric as the first man, and of course, in 1845, when this movie takes place, Darwinian evolution hadn't been introduced. Darwin's On the Origin of Species hadn't been published yet, so the movie is sort of doing this very playful sort of historical revisionism where and it's great because obviously Miracle is right, and we're watching it in the 21st century and we know that Miracle is correct, that that human beings, I mean, it's sort of a bastardization of evolutionary theory, but it sort of can be forgiven because Miracle is technically presenting his theories several decades before Darwin officially presented his theory, where Darwin's theory wasn't so much that we directly evolved from apes so much as we have common descent with apes to a certain organism. But that's a sort of by sort of because at the time the movie was made, Darwinian evolution had kind of become accepted in the sciences as popular as consensus in academia, but it was not so much at a popular level readily accepted or even in terms of regions necessarily tolerated. You still had towns in America that forbade the teaching of evolution as opposed to biblical creationism. And so it's a very, so there's this sort of duality to it, because on the one level, you have to suspect that the filmmakers were aware that, Miracle is correct, that his theory is more or less accurate. But he's, in context, because of where he is at this time, he must necessarily also be a madman, because, he's a heretic who is this, who has this totally quack-brained idea, and I don't know, what is your I'm kind of finding it hard to sort of tease out.
Well, he's looking for the ideal subject in which you can mix gorilla blood with human blood and have that person either change or survive.
Right.
To prove his theory that the ape is man.
Yeah, he's conducting
in the most reductionist way. And I'll tell you, back then, it's not that far-fetched. I think experimenting is the problem. I mean, the problem is that using human experimentation and disposing of bodies that end up in the Rue Morgue, right? The actual morgue. Which means the street where the morgue is on, right? So,
right. Well, and that's these are
but I think it's very interesting. But it has a lot of overtures to the evolution, and it goes to race. It goes to a lot of the features. I think some of these things you touch upon in your notes as I glanced over them, and there is some you almost, and people are telling them. Some people say they agree with him, and other people are saying you're wrong.
Some people laugh at him,
right.
And
he said, "I'll prove to you." That.
Yeah, and his experiments, like you say, his experiments boil down to trying to find, and one of this following scenes is of perhaps it's constantly sort of shocking to me just how macabre and grotesque a lot of these scenes in these old 30s movies were, because there's this wonderfully elaborate scene where he happens upon two sailors in a knife fight over a lady of the night, a lady of the evening, who is sort of just screaming as these two men go at each other, and in the process they both kill each other. And then Miracle, and what a wonderful name for the villain, because Miracle is technically it, but it's clearly derivative of Miracle, Dr. Right. Miracle. He sort
Let's say Miracle, just
Miracle,
to give him more of a...
Yeah,
but you're right, Miracle, right.
He swoops in and takes this woman, and then the next scene...
Yeah, she's up in stocks or whatever.
Well, she's crucified, basically. Yes. Like, it's not like a standard crucifix, but it's a... it's a cross... it's an X of... plank
it's
wood.
To King Kong.
Yeah, sort of like that.
Right? She's tied up and she's dangling.
Yeah, she's spread eagle on this this X planks of wood, and he's trying to get blood into a syringe so he can examine her. And it's interesting because you can see, and like looking into the production information, you can see where they, by focusing on the blood, you can still see where they're burying the lead of what, or the innuendo of what his experiments are ultimately working towards, because he talks about taking the blood and trying to find the perfect blood that he can match with his gorilla. But, when he says to this woman, like, you will be the bride of science.
You stubborn! Hush! It will only last one more minute and we shall see. We shall know if you are to be the bride of science.
You can see the vestiges of the original conception of the movie, where originally what his motivation was to be was he was literally going to attempt to mate a human woman with Eric the ape in order to prove his theories. So there's a sort of
I didn't know that was the case, but I guess he was hoping that one someone would survive and therefore be the mate.
Yeah, that he
Right.
could mix the blood and therefore that they would mate. And obviously he never states it explicitly,
No,
but
right.
but the innuendo is still heavily there throughout the movie. And of course it turns out the prostitute has syphilis apparently, or like she has black spots in her blood, so she has some sort of STD.
That's a good point. I didn't pick that out from his thick language. I didn't realize that's what he said. Okay.
And then it again becomes
He
this.
says you're not pure enough or whatever.
Yeah,
Interesting enough.
yeah. Like there's a
okay.
lot. Yeah, he's a very fascinating character because he sort of rants at her about her sins. Like he's despite the fact that he's kidnapped this woman and crucified her, now he's like condemning her for being a whore. Like he's like, oh, it's because of your sins that you're.
Well, he thinks his actions are pure because he's doing some
Right.
kind of crazy science.
And
A lot of
then
scientists think that way.
right, and then of course she dies on the rack. And it's fascinating because he seems to show actual remorse, and that's the thing is
Right.
that like he kneels down and he starts praying, and there's this weird sort of quality to the scene where he's kneeling and praying before this crucified prostitute, and it's like this. And, like regional censors at the time very much picked up on this. They were very offended by this aspect of the movie. It's full of like religious allusions and sort of blasphemous Christian imagery.
Yeah, it's really funny. You can't kiss for more than 15 seconds, but you can show all this imagery. Fantastic.
Well, in certain regions you can't. That was my point. Like, especially in southern states, they were highly offended by
No, I meant
the Catholic
I meant the film.
The Catholic Legion of Decency had were
Well,
absolutely apoplectic about this movie.
This is probably what I would call morally objectionable for all.
Yeah, more
as it would be in my old newspaper when I was a kid.
Yeah, and it so like yeah, so
Catholic
let's think
Monitor.
of like again, it's like and so it's like we have these sort of two strains of like symbolism here. One is the weird sort of psychosexual sort of horrific presentation of evolution, because even if the filmmakers believe in evolution, even if they accept it as sort of a scientific consensus, they're nonetheless making a movie about a quack doctor whose belief in evolution sort of snowballs into a kind of pathological mania that leads him to do all of these horrific things, and it sort of disturbs the natural order, of course, because by doing this, he, of course, and the classic Hollywood way of demonstrating that you're getting in the way of the natural God-given order of things, you're standing in between Camille and Pierre, the two lovers. Like, that's the way you show that, like, you're the bad guy, is by saying, oh, you're getting in the way of heterosexual coupling. But then there's the other thread, which is all of the religious imagery, the blasphemous religious imagery. Obviously, Dr. Miracle, the image of the prostitute, sort of, and like the being condemned for her sins, but actually it's the person who's condemning her who is the most guilty of all. And even the way there's a single cutaway close-up of her where she even looks very much like Christ with her head hanging. It's like a La Pieta pose.
Yes.
I'm even thinking of a.
I always wondered why that close-up was taken that way, to show her dead. You're right. No, you're right.
And
absolutely.
and I'm even thinking of like there's even a scene where there's a scene where Pierre and Camille and all of their friends all of them, basically these bohemian young people, like I'm assuming mostly students and, working class girls who just go on a holiday to the river to have a picnic. And there's a wonderful montage of all of the men just like, telling the women sweet nothings, like
Right.
saying, I love you, you're the only one,
Right.
like again, like the sort of like
Yeah, there were a lot of cuts like
the
there were 3 or
innuendo.
4, right?
There's
Yeah.
a lot. That's
Yeah.
another thing. There's a lot of heavy innuendo in the
Oh, yes,
movie.
a lot.
Like it's a very horny movie.
It is.
Like but like
For what it could do.
But
Yes,
but
yeah.
as far as the religious imagery, I also realize that they're all, because I guess because they can't afford horses, they're all riding donkeys, and of course the donkey is also a
well,
classic
yeah, it is.
image of Christianity.
I
Of
think
course,
that's
Jesus rides into
What's
Jerusalem
he say?
on
He
a.
says something. He calls out to the girl. It seems to be a ritual that's very common. Everybody gets on donkeys and does this. Didn't seem to be out of the ordinary. They said, "Let's get together and we'll get on donkeys." And
Yeah.
But
But he
you're
does.
right.
But they did include
right.
That's the thing. They did include a close up of the donkey, so they clearly
Yeah.
wanted you to take
Yeah.
in the fact that they're riding asses. Like this is like it's part of the metaphor, this whole symbolic thread of the movie, and so that's wonderful. And of course, you have this really wonderful shot in the film where. Camille is on a swing and Pierre is swinging, and the camera is
absolute
there's
focus, the entire motion.
a deep focus shot of the camera in wide on the swing, so you're following with Camille as she's swinging back and forth through the air. This very fluid shot. There's so
Really,
it's a very
nice touch.
It's
Nice
a very
touches.
in your face and audacious movie, highly stylistic to a certain extent, and ways that you can unpackage it. So I guess we should maybe just go through them one by one in the order that you sort of brought them up. Like I brought up the religious imagery, but you brought up the sort of subtextual relationship between the horrific presentation of evolution, this sort of like subtextual idea of like the knowledge of evolution itself disrupting the conventional order and the conventional way of seeing things, with man as the center of the universe and sort of, human beings as being like unique and special in a kind of God-given creation. You had brought up, like, obviously there's a sort of subtextual racial phobia at work in the movie, and when we go and that's the thing, is like even that aspect of the film is right there on the surface, because once we get to the carnival, we have 2 exhibits before we get to Eric the Ape Man. What are the 2 exhibits?
Well, they're white women painted black or dark.
Yeah, the Fatima dancers.
Right.
This way, this way. See the naughty notch nymphs, the adorable Arab angel.
And, not to get sidetracked by the religion.
Fatima.
Yeah, not to get sidetracked by the religious stuff. That was also the Catholic Legion of Decency was also offended by that.
Fatima, right? Yeah.
Right. For those of you who don't know, you should Google Our Lady of Fatima.
Right.
There was, in the late 1920s, there was a spree of alleged visitations by the Virgin Mary in the form of Fatima in Portugal that the Catholic Church canonically accepts as canonical miraculous visitation. So the inclusion in the movie is absolutely.
Boy, this guy went all overboard to
look,
really piss people off.
No, seriously, like it seems.
Right?
But yeah, there's this thing.
Pisses off the guy in the beginning, time we're evolving from apes. He says you're full of it.
He gets accused of heresy.
So,
but
how many were there? Was more than one though? So was the dancing?
Well, let's talk about
the
the Fatima dancers, because
Right.
again, the sexual attitude is all the way on the surface. Because again, another line that the censors in a lot of regions wanted cut. There's these 2 horny old men who ask each other. One asks the other, do they bite? And the other says, yes, but you have to pay extra. These Fatima dancers, these scantily clad belly dancers. And then one of the Pierre Camille asks Pierre, do you think that they're painted or that's their real skin or something like that?
So you want me to check?
Yeah, exactly. And of course, and then she slaps him. But so so
doesn't he ask her first? Can you dance like that?
Yeah.
Will you dance like that? No,
no. His friend, his fat friend.
Will you dance like that for me? No.
His fat friend. I think that's Paul, played by Burt Roach. I recognize him from somewhere. He's some sort of comic character actor. But yeah, he
wasn't very not as effective as the comic relief we've seen in other films, but he was all right. I mean, he's okay. He seems to play the
sort of,
the less informed individual of the pair, which makes it funny because they're roommates, right?
Yeah, they're roommates.
It's not clear what he does. They're familiar with.
Well, we know that he does the working because, apparently Pierre is some kind of medical student or scientific student.
Right.
And of course, in these sorts of movies, if you're a scientist of one variety, that's enough.
Right,
like you're basically
you're on a lamb.
you're a jack of all trades if you're a scientist in a movie. You could be a general practitioner and a chemist and an archaeologist. It really doesn't matter. But yeah, so that's so there's already this sort of very lascivious racial. So regardless of whether the women themselves are in fact women of color, whether they're Arab or I guess Spanish Arab, sort of like,
I have no idea.
But they're sort of orientalized women. So there's already that sort of lascivious sexualization of exotic women. And then the next, would you like to tell us the next exhibit after the Fatima dancers?
Oh man, I can't remember. What was the next one?
It's the Savage Redskins. It's the Native Americans.
Native Americans. That's
and I know for a fact that those were absolutely Native American actors, and like all Native American actors in movies of these periods, they just sort of stand there silent and clearly kind of pissed off that they're once again playing these silent savage roles.
Introducing Colonel Ha-Ha from America. Ho, ho, ho! Bloodthirsty savages from the wilds of America! Ha, ha, ha! See the Redskins scalp their victims! First time in Paris! They're Apaches, my friends! Apaches!
But it's this thing where there's almost a sort of tinge of subversiveness to it. Because the carnival barker is literally calling these men bloodthirsty savages at the same time that the actor who is playing the sort of like Colonel Custard figure that they've kind of captured in the exhibit, he's just shaking their hands like, it's like, oh, we're all pals here. We know each other personally. We're just actors. But so like before we even get to Eric the Ape Man, there is already the foregrounding in this carnival, ostensibly a freak show, ostensibly a sideshow, of the foregrounding of race itself as a kind of puerile and lascivious and exhibitionist sort of spectacle to be gawked at and laughed at by white people, by, white Europeans. And
right.
It's very uncomfortable.
It is uncomfortable, yes.
I mean, it's always uncomfortable when movies of this period deal in race because they're, it's like they're kind of, I've said this before, but like, movies during this period are going to be programmatically racist just by definition. Like the times themselves were incredibly, we're pretty racist now, but the 1930s were definitely incredibly racist. So we have this sort of sequencing from the Fatima dancers, the lascivious Oriental woman, to the savage red man. Both these are essential part, and like these aren't accidental. These are essential parts of white supremacist myth making. The idea of the Eastern man and woman as these sort of intemperate, over-sexual, decadent beings that are sort of incompatible with civilization and are kind of just there to be tempters and such.
Sure. Right.
And then, of course, the savage red man, the sort of the depiction of that sort of justifies the expropriation of land and the quartering and the killing of Native Americans and indigenous peoples and the process of colonialism. these very essential productions in popular culture that rationalize and reinforce a white supremacist hierarchy.
Right.
And so then we transition to Dr. Miracle.
He disrupts the whole idea.
Right,
He
because
turns it on its head.
Yeah, because he says you
are no different than this ape.
Yeah, like this ape is the first man. He
right.
is you're
right. He turns it on its
your
head.
grandpa was a monkey.
Right.
You know.
Right.
And this is the thing that's very
just like in True Romance, your great
All right,
grandmother.
don't say the line. We're not gonna say the line. But yes,
I'm talking about.
Yeah, I know what you're referring to.
Dennis Hopper.
But no, it's like, but that's the thing is that like it's like, and this is the thing is that there's a certain level to which, again, like it sort of goes back to this thing of like it cannot be understated, like how recent events like the Scopes monkey trial were, like these high-profile legal incidents where there is a broad public hostility to the teaching of evolution, even just on the basic religious level, on the basic cultural level, how hostile the public was in certain areas, especially in rural and Midwestern and broad swaths of conservative America, to even the premise that the Earth is millions of years old, that humans are not biologically unique, that we are descended from, either by common descent or, of course, it becomes bastardized to being, my grandpa wasn't no monkey, like that sort of thing. Like that but more or less, yes, that we're descended from apes.
Right.
The hostility to, but there's also this sort of, there's also the even once you accept evolution in academia as scientific consensus, evolution almost immediately in the 19th and early 20th century becomes incorporated into pre-extant theories of race and hierarchies of race, so that you get this new 20th century phenomenon of scientific racism. The whole thing about like you can measure the skulls of people in order to determine, their state of evolution. Like,
right.
And of course, these things that like, it's like Darwin sort of, he did have a theory that like, of course, like the part of his theory that is no longer subscribed to or no longer held as accurate is that Darwin had an idea that that evolution naturally led to more complexity, which in the late 19th and early 20th century, as these ideas became accepted, becomes incorporated into a racialized hierarchy where you basically say, well, of course, white people are the most intellectually and physically complex of the races.
Right.
And so it can't be understated on that level that, like, even from a scientific perspective, Miracle can still be seen as, like, at once an outsider to this culture because he's saying something that at a visceral popular level they're going to reject as heresy, but on another level is basically just revealing the grotesque underpinnings of scientific racism, of where it naturally leads to, which is basically this premise of certain races of humans being naturally inferior.
Right, because they're probably closer to the lineage of the beginning than white man.
Right. And so I guess I did just want to touch upon the idea that, like, again, it's hard to even comprehend the kind of it can be hard to comprehend the inhumanity of settler colonial and Western European societies, especially to indigenous peoples and Africans during this period. And it shouldn't come as a surprise because, again, like this is, even in the 1930s when this movie is made, this really isn't that far off from the Civil War. We're talking a difference of just 90 years. We're talking the span of a lifetime. There had been people who lived through the Civil War who were still alive at the time these movies were being made and who are still inculcated in all of these myths about the natural superiority of white people. And so once it gets into the question of scientific racism, this thing that the Murders in the Rue Morgue is presenting, this idea of non-white people as sideshow exhibits, and more importantly, something that you could juxtapose with literal animals, with apes and monkeys, this is absolutely not an invention of the film. This is something that was done not only in carnivals, not only in sideshows, but literally in modern zoos, that often you would have Africans who were kidnapped and put in enclosures to be gawked at by white people.
Right.
And not only that, but oftentimes put in enclosures with apes, with orangutans, with chimpanzees, with gorillas, so that a tour guide could show, or that a placard could say, well, here you can see the, this is how they taught evolution. This is like, here you can see the natural progression from the ape to the black man to the white man, where obviously the white man is, again, so it's this sort of prefiguring as the white person as unique, whereas there is this presumptive, like, liminal association between the black man or the savage and the ape. And so you see that in Eric, because despite the fact that Eric is played in close-up by a chimpanzee, he is played by an actor in an ape suit, and his motivations are really not, very much like an ape. He's not a naturalistic figure. So, like, would you like to... So, basically, how do Camille and Pierre's paths cross in this story with Dr. Miracle? Like, what happens that sort of leads Camille puts Camille in Miracle's sights?
I guess Miracle sees that she's bonding with the ape, that the ape wants to have her bonnet. And so she gives the bonnet to the ape.
To Eric. He has a name.
And Eric then for some reason, the crazy Dr. Miracle thinks that there's some kind of bond here. Maybe she'll turn out to be a better specimen.
The bride of science.
The bride of science. And so that's where you're introduced, and then of course Dr. Miracle sends her a new bonnet, and that's how. Then of course there's she has her followed.
Yeah,
so
he tries to convince her to come to him multiple times.
Right, and then
he finally just sends Eric to kidnap her.
Right, but right, exactly. But she's. I mean, it's kind of a crazy story, but in a way that it does illustrate the kinds of reasoning that go through the mind of Dr. Miracle. Just the kind of things that he picks up on, thinking that there's some kind of it's showing something. It's a sign of something. So he's grasping for straws, I guess, to figure out what is the fastest way he can prove his theory. And this turns out to be one of the cases where she somehow bonds with the ape, and the ape bonds with her.
The ape bonds with her, and I think that's the more important thing that I'm getting to, is that this definitely starts to become a formula of apes in horror movies or horror adjacent movies at this time. And like, one of the things that's interesting is that one of the immediate ways in which filmmakers capitalized upon the sort of popularization of Darwinian theory, or the public's conscious awareness of Darwinian evolution, one of the main ways that they capitalized upon it before this period was just to make it the subject of humor. Put monkeys and apes in, suits and stuff, put them on tricycles, show them doing mundane things,
right.
And, use comic levity to sort of, just sort of coax people into the idea that it's not that big a deal. Look, you're still special. These are clearly just, sort of, they're simpleton animals. And so...
Or like a calliope and a monkey.
Right.
He's playing the calliope, and at the same time the monkey is... Right.
The educated ape.
With its hat, with its tuxedo on, or its striped suit and its hat, and doing various things, right?
Right. And so And so one of the things that contemporary critics who did not respond very well to the movie for various reasons, one of the things that they did cite as an example of like, they rejected it kind of its horrific potential because they were confused by the premise of using an ape as a monster when audiences were so used to seeing them as comic relief. But what's interesting about the Murders in the Rue Morgue is that you start to see it as a predictor of a formula for how apes become used in horror and horror-adjacent movies. And the thing that is essential is the idea of apes forming, especially chimpanzees and gorillas, the idea of apes forming special bonds with women, particularly white women. Mm-hmm. This idea that they become like the almost like essence of this beautiful white starlet,
right. Sure.
just overcomes them, despite the fact that like there's this obviously there's this bestial
right.
barrier between
sure.
them.
Right.
And so like, so what are so obviously, we're setting up the premise here is like, like there's a direct through line between Murders of the Rue Morgue and King Kong. Like this idea of like so, like, let's count some parallels. What's one parallel? I think you can probably pick a very obvious one between Murders in the Rue Morgue and King Kong.
Well, the most obvious one is that this gorilla picks on one woman, one particular woman that he focuses on. So there's clearly a selection out of other women. So, and you see that in King Kong, right? So King Kong doesn't care about other women. He wants Fay Ray, or he wants whoever.
He wants Ann Darrow.
Ann Darrow to be his bride or his companion, and that's one of the parallels. The other parallel is the end, because
the climax. What happens in the climax of Murders in the Rue Morgue?
Well, he falls off the roof. Well, first of all, number one, he kills Miracle because he won't let Miracle take his blood.
Yeah,
because he knows the blood's going into her and may kill her.
See, that's interesting. You didn't expound on that to me. So you think that's his motivation?
Absolutely.
Is that he's protecting her?
Yeah, because obviously
he's seen what's happened before,
right? And not to her. It's maybe to someone else, but not to her. At least, or maybe that was he doesn't want to see it happen again to another woman. So.
Miracle gets got by his own creation.
Right. Even in the remake, the gorilla kills the owner.
Yeah, there's been several adaptations. You're thinking of
all the same thing. The theme is that the attraction of the gorilla or the fondness of the gorilla for the woman, and then the destruction of the controller because of the fact that they won't cross that barrier to do harm to that particular woman.
But you're like you say, the climax of the film is entirely oriented around the ape escapes, just like in King Kong. The ape carries the woman, just like in King Kong. Climbs to the top of the tallest height he can reach, like in King Kong.
Right.
And then once he puts her down, is shot off the roof, just like in King Kong, and falls to his death. Very morbid stuff. I genuinely felt bad for Eric. Like, obviously, he's a sort of tragic figure in this whole thing, and that
they're used, right? They're used as They get used. So
but of course, like, but like, this is the thing that's interesting is that, like, I can't really say, like, it's not like one inspired the other, because King Kong had been in development, I think, since like 1931. Like, that was when Marion C. Cooper was first starting to, like, incubate this idea of what the kind of story you want to tell. So there's these fascinating parallels that occur of these two completely different filmmakers who come to a very similar storyline, and not just storyline, but the superficial content of it, and also the themes of it. This idea of the monster as sort of a tragic figure who is used and but has to be destroyed because his mere existence is incompatible with the sort of formulaic natural order of things. And of course, just like in King Kong, there's obviously the symbolic, not just the psychosexual aspect of it, which is, of course, the bestial sort of naive lust of an animal for a woman, this sort of puerile fixation.
It seems like more of a bond. that has to do beyond that, right? So
Yeah.
obviously killing the owner, not having her die, but still taking her.
Yeah. Yeah,
Uh, but
that's
it's hard to
that's
tell
another
whether he's,
that's another
is he
parallel.
taking her or is he protecting her? So
Well, like that's the same thing you could ask about King Kong.
Right.
It's like these monsters can't speak for themselves.
Right.
You can only sort of observe them. And what's interesting about Murders in the Rue Morgue is that because when it's the only way you get a close up is it's of a real animal. So the animal isn't acting. So like there's this sort of weird, but like even another parallel between it and King Kong. There's also a particular scene. It comes earlier in Murders in the Rue Morgue where it's an article of clothing that becomes a sort of naive fascination for the animal, where it's the bonnet for Camille. For Ann Darrow, it's Kong literally stripping off her clothing and sort of putting it up to his nose and smelling it. But the thing is that like it's sort of the thing where like now there's like this other weird sort of Oedipal element to it. Like it's not just sort of psychosexual; it's almost like maternal. Like you're saying, there's a sort of multi-level sort of bonding between the animal and the woman. And so with Murders in the Rue Morgue in particular, you get this close-up of just a chimpanzee sort of putting a bonnet in its mouth and sort of sucking on it like a baby. And so it's like, it's interesting because it's like, being able to see the ape itself that close up, even more than King Kong, it makes you like, it makes you appreciate like Eric as a character. Like, I'm surprised at how well it worked because it shouldn't work on paper. The moment they cut away from the close up to the guy, Charles Gamora in the ape suit, it really shouldn't work, but like it just kind of does. Like psychologically you just carry over that image of
you don't mind the transition or the intercut with that. You don't mind it. Right.
I mean, I think that speaks in part to the Florey's and Carl Freund's good sense of never showing Charles Gamora too close up. Like frequently when he's in the suit, his back is to the camera.
Right.
You never really see his
so
face.
So far away, it really doesn't. You can sometimes you get a frontal shot where you see him, but not enough to really.
Yeah, and it's usually in wide, so you're not really focused. So it's like it's very well done. But so obviously you see like there's this formula that's evolving of the ape as sort of a kind of perfect metaphor for the sort of horrific sort of destabilization of not just the idea of man being a unique creature and being the center of the universe, but specifically the white man being the sort of natural inheritor of the world.
Even the ape.
Right.
So the ape, in King Kong, the ape rejects the black sacrifices, right?
Yeah, blondes are scarce around here.
Right. So
well, yeah,
it has that same kind of.
Yeah, there's like again, there's still this programmatic racism. Like it has to be a white woman who's the special object. But then that's again, it's the liminal juxtaposition between the ape and the non-white person, where what's clearly the fear that is being veiled here is precisely the idea of the black man or the savage having its way with and taking away the white woman. It's rape imagery.
No, but
basically.
I don't know if it's true or not. I think it's more. It can be seen that way, but I think even on a less dramatic comparison is that it shows that there's a commonality between the Eric and the woman. And that sometimes is more disturbing to people than the actual imagery that you're projecting. The idea of rape or domination, whatever you want to call that, involving two different species, or a black man and white women. So there's something about that. It's something more hidden in it. And but it's never crossed. Here it's not crossed. It's not crossed in the first King Kong. But in subsequent King Kong,
it becomes way more overt.
The failure is now there's a bond in reverse.
Right, where she
starts. So Ann Darrow now sympathizes and hates the lover temporarily because of the damage she's doing to something that has saved her
Well, that she appreciates as beautiful. That
Right.
she starts to realize
Right.
that he's
and
an
and
intelligent.
I hate to tell you, that wrecks the whole film.
Yeah, you don't like that?
I don't like that at all. I think keeping it separate like that.
Do you think it's patronizing
It
to a
is.
certain
It's
extent?
patronizing.
Yeah.
Although they're excellent movies, don't get me
But
wrong.
you see that evolution even in Mighty Joe Young too, where it's like, again, it's like it always has to be a woman. The woman needs to be
Right,
like,
takes her dress off to bind his wound, right?
yeah,
When
like
he hurts his finger.
Yeah, like there's again, like these images keep repeating themselves, but it shows you, doesn't it? It's like the woman either is the victim,
Or the interlocutor. Right,
she
right.
either needs to be rescued from like the maw of savagery by the white man,
Or the ape.
or she needs to be the maternal figure. She needs to, she needs to calm the mad brute. She needs to be the one that sort of becomes this maternal inheritor. But, like, just as far as, like, the clear racial subtext to it, like, I can't really mention this movie or King Kong without mentioning their natural antecedents. So, in 1930, there's a movie released, an independently made movie released called Ingagi. Now, Ingagi passes itself off as an ethnography. It's not an ethnography. It's not shot in Borneo like it claims. It's shot in Southern California in studios. It doesn't depict, it depicts some black actresses, but it also depicts white women in blackface. It's a very shoddy production overall. But the premise of Ingagi is that it purports to be a documentary depicting a tribe in Borneo where the women of this tribe are given over as sex slaves to gorillas with whom they then mate and have progeny, who in the film are represented by baby chimpanzees. It's obviously it's grotesque, it's like it's very disgusting, but it's this thing where it's like, again, like, you see, it's sort of like the Ingagi in a way is sort of like the patient zero of how popular culture comes to like fully utilize apes in order to express all of the accumulated anxieties about evolution and race
And miscegenation.
Of
Right,
course, like
right.
this idea that it's and I guess that's where you're right. It's like it's not just a fear of rape, because the rape is the projection, right?
Right.
The rape is the thing that white supremacy needs to project onto this animal, this liminal savage semi-human figure, in order to rationalize what's happening. What cannot be tolerated at all is the idea that like there is like a legitimate bond being formed between these two figures.
Heresy!
Heresy. Do they still burn men for heresy? Then burn me, monsieur. Light the fire. Do you think your little candle will outshine the flame of truth? Do you think these boards and curtains are my whole life? They are only a trap to catch the pennies of fools. My life is consecrated to a great experiment. I tell you, I will prove your kinship with the ape.
I mean, what do you think about Lugosi in the film? Like,
Which one? Oh, this one here?
Yeah, as Miracle.
Excellent. He's excellent. Absolutely excellent. I think he's one of his better performances. I just think he's got pretty good range in it. And I think he does a really excellent job. But I think that he needs, I mean, a lot of it has to do with how the directors and how the writers framed each scene. But he, like I said, when he comes on the scene, everything seems to slow down a pace, and it's his world when he's there. So I think it's probably some of the best acting that I've seen from Lugosi in many pictures. A lot of times he plays a minor character in a lot of the films.
Yeah,
especially later ones like the Body Snatcher. He plays a minor character. In the movie that we saw with the people that are all kept in cages underground where the
Oh
skies
yeah,
and brain.
that
He
was
plays
the
just-
Black Sleep.
He
Yeah,
plays a dumb.
well, that was really late in his career, and
Yeah,
he
it's
was
probably
clearly
yeah.
just completely out of it
Right.
by that point. Like, yeah, he like again, it's like this sort of like
Really, it's a shame because it's a talent that could have been used. But I
this
think,
is like this is a real peak for him performance wise in film, but it's also kind of the beginning of the end, and
It
it's
is.
kind of
it is, and it's a shame. But I think you're right, though. I think in a certain way, it's hard to tell. He needed to be given a chance to see what he could have done in other kinds of films if they weren't so fixated on, you know, not get fixated on finding. Well, they're looking for the best bang for the buck, aren't they? So looking for saleability, right?
right.
For a film. So
But
it
they're
makes
also
it-
looking for a kind of narrow compatibility. Like, like you just wonder, it's like, like
Well, he has an aesthetic that you just can't find an ordinary. It doesn't seems like he play an ordinary character.
well, I don't know, and that's the thing is that like we'll never really
No,
know.
you never
Like
know.
no one
No.
ever really, cast him as like, just like an old
Right,
man.
right.
Like, like just a foreign like, just an immigrant old man
Right.
who play, he could definitely play in a drama of some kind.
Sure.
Or in a melodrama. Like, and that's the thing is that like, in a better future for him, maybe not in the 30s and 40s, but definitely like in the 50s where you start to see like sort of more immigrant experienced focused dramas, you could definitely see Lugosi at least having some kind of supporting role
Yeah.
where you could really see like
No, because
his humanity and
even in he plays Bela in The Wolfman, and again, it's just a minor character. He plays a gypsy. You're right. Nothing's really fleshed out where he can play except here. And of course, in other films, Dracula, of course. I mean, where he is the central figure. But yeah, it's just the way it is.
Yeah.
I mean,
this movie is of course loosely based off of Edgar Allan Poe's short story of the same name. There's really not much to talk about in terms of it because there really is no similarity. I only really mention that loose inspiration because the next, when we come back for our next episode next week, it's going to be another movie loosely inspired by a work of short fiction, this time not credited. But, so we're basically, we're seeing the sort of, this is sort of like Bela Lugosi's peak and his downfall as an actor. And sort of, this is the moment where this movie began as a B production. Its budget kind of ballooned over the course of filmmaking. It was a disappointment at the box office. So this is the beginning of Lugosi going out and Karloff's star starting to rise. So when we come back next week, we'll be discussing another movie from 1932. This one, the Karloff star vehicle from that year. We'll be discussing The Mummy. So stay tuned and join us next week for Monster Craze Memoirs. So we're going to be signing off for now.
See you later, everyone.
Have we not met before, Miss Grosvenor?
No, I don't think so. I don't think one would forget meeting you out of the